Hello and welcome to episode 594 of the podcast devoted to the classic and sometimes not so classic genre cinema of yesteryear. We're talking about Monster Kid Radio, and I'm your writer, host, producer, Derek M. Cook. Welcome to the show. I'm happy to have you here. Thank you for tuning in. Speaking of tuning in, let's tune into some music. Right now, you are listening to the song Out Cold. It's from the band Bloodshot Bill. It's from their album Songs from the Sludge. You can find them at bloodshotbill.bandcamp.com. Check them out when you're done listening to this episode of the podcast. I'm excited about this week's podcast because I'm going old school, man. I'm going back to one of the building blocks of, well, me as a monster kid. When we think classic monster movies, we think Universal. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Universal really was kind of the thing, right? Universal's monsters define so much of what we do here. And I wanted to get back to the Universal. It's been too long, so let's talk about House of Dracula. No, don't go anywhere. Trust me. It's a better movie than you might think. I've actually warmed up to it quite a bit over the years, and it's a great conversation with Stephen D. Sullivan. All right, I thought that would keep you here. Steve and I are going to talk about House of Dracula. Plus, it's not an episode of Monster Kid Radio without Mark Matzke's Beta Capsule review, Kenny's look at Famous Monsters of Filmland, and a tiny bit of feedback.
It's time.
It's time?
Yes, it's time.
It's time for Monster Kid Radio Mail Call.
This email comes in response to one of Kenny's segments. Kenny recently talked about the TV movie or presentation or short film Halloween Planet, which he hadn't seen, I hadn't seen. I mentioned how I wanted to see it, that sort of thing. Well, Brian S. wrote in and says, I'm sure somebody else has already written in. Well, that's not true. Nobody else has. So you're the first. I'm sure somebody else has pointed out that Halloween Planet is an extra on the 25th anniversary DVD of The Alien Dead. Not a really cheap disc anymore, but available used for around $20. Take care. You know, that kind of makes sense. Since Halloween Planet and The Alien Dead both were created or fronted by Fred Olen Ray. I don't own The Alien Dead on DVD. I wish I did, actually, because now I want to see this Halloween Planet thing, man. If anybody has seen it or has a lead on it, I'd love to see it. Or I'd love to hear about it. Maybe call in and let me know how it is. If you want to be cool like Brian, you can email me at monsterkidradio@gmail.com, or you can call and leave us a voicemail at our voicemail line, 360-524-2484.
White Zombie, a new novelization of the classic horror movie from award-winning author Stephen D. Sullivan. Available now in print and all ebook formats. Find it on Amazon, Smashwords, Drive-Thru Fiction, and other quality outlets. Also available in a special edition, including the complete movie script. Grab White Zombie before it grabs you. Details at sdsullivan.com.
Terror's House of Horrors. Horrors the screen has never before dared to depict. The terrifying horror of man killing vine with a human brain that creeps and kills. The terrifying horror of the dead, entombed for 200 years, that creeps its way back to terrorize the living. The terrifying horror of a dreaded man called Dr. Terror, who, with his deck of mystic cards, could foretell destiny. Dr. Terror's House of Horrors.
Live from the Land of Light in Nebula M78, home of the mighty Ultra Heroes, it's Monster Kid Radio's Beta Capsule Review. A sepia-toned montage reviewing Ultra 7's powers and abilities turns out to be an alien conference, the main topic of which is the 7 Assassination Plan in the series' 39th episode. Although plagued by a rash of false alarms, Dan and Anne are sent on a nighttime investigation where Dan is confronted by alien guts who make the bold claim that they have never lost in any sort of fight. Dan activates Capsule Monster Wyndham, but is shocked when the robot is destroyed by an alien guts laser beam. The Ultra Guard swoops in to rescue Dan and Anne, but the alien guts lure Ultra 7 into a direct confrontation which ends with 7 trapped in a transparent cross. TDF ground forces engage in a pitched battle with a guts flying saucer, but the alien craft easily repels their barrage and commences to announce the execution of Ultra 7 at dawn of the next day. As the Guard wrestles with the question of how to help 7, Anne advocates for locating Dan, but the discussion is interrupted by news that a mysterious tone was being broadcast using the TDF space station's circuits. Will dawn bring the execution of Ultra 7 and the ruin of humanity? An honest-to-goodness cliffhanger, Episode 39 rockets along at a breakneck pace and presents the unthinkable, an opponent in alien guts that outmatches Ultra 7 at every turn. Screenwriter Keisuke Fujikawa expertly builds tension throughout the episode while focusing on the Anne and Dan dynamic, giving the high stakes a personal edge. This is a visually rich experience, from the stylized introduction to the alien guts design, but nothing else is quite as striking as the cruciform Ultra 7 floating against a blood-red sunset, in what is likely the series' most iconic image. For Monster Kid Radio's Beta Capsule Review, this is Mark Matzke reporting.
The Masters of Horror present the masterpieces of screen horror from 20th Century Fox, Frankenstein Created Woman, and The Mummy's Shroud. Frankenstein, now he has created his most diabolical horror. The ultimate in evil, a beautiful woman with the soul of the devil. Then, beware the beat of the cloth-wrapped feet. Beware the mummy's shroud. The ultimate in evil, the absolute in terror from the Shockmasters. Together in the same double shock show, Frankenstein Created Woman and the Mummy's Shroud in dripping color.
Tales of horror that will give you the creeps.
This is going to be extremely painful, Mr. Verrill.
The most fun you'll ever have being scared. Creep Show, rated R.
Now playing at a theater near you.
5 years ago, the Lutz family fled their home in Amityville, New York. They were lucky to escape with their lives. But the previous owners, the Montellis, weren't so lucky. They were caught by the original evil that possessed the house, an evil that drove their son to destroy everything and everyone he loved. Now, Amityville 2, The Possession, rated R.
Starts tomorrow, APCO, Westwood, Paramount, Hollywood, and selected theaters.
Hello there, Monster Kid Radio Hits. This is Kenny with a look at Famous Monsters of Filmland. This is part 3 of our Halloween celebration, and today we are going to look at the third part of a trilogy named after the popular holiday. Michael Myers is back. Or is he? Let's find out how FM 189 from the fall of 1983 answered that question in its 5-page article with 8 photos. Sequel Mania. No, Sequel Mania isn't the title of a new terror flick. It's the name of a game that's played in Hollywood. The rules are simple. If a movie makes lots of money, do more like it. If a movie makes incredible amounts of money, do the same thing over again. More than any other film buffs, monster movie fans have suffered sequels which are inferior to the originals and at the same time beat their themes to death. Some exceptions. The Bride of Frankenstein, which many fantasy film followers feel is superior to the original. Superman 2, a film that lacked the drama and characterization of its predecessor, but made up for it in the action department. The Empire Strikes Back, an extension rather than a rehash of Star Wars. But the list of less than satisfactory sequels is far, far longer. Just a few titles would be Son of Kong, whose story was not a rerun of the original, but whose leading ape was but a pale shadow of his great pop. Christopher Lee's later Dracula films, like The Satanic Rites of Dracula. Hammer's last Frankenstein pictures, such as The Horror of Frankenstein. The Universal Monster Fests of the 1940s, including The Ghost of Frankenstein and Son of Dracula. If Halloween 2 was a disappointment to people who wanted to see the saga take a few new turns, it was not a letdown as far as the public was concerned. Halloween 2 was a moneymaker, so it was no surprise when a third Halloween picture was announced. What was a surprise, and a pleasant one, is that the film is an original. It goes in an entirely different direction from the first 2 films, leaving the shape in the grave and returning to the supernatural meaning of the holiday itself. The decision to go ahead with the new picture was made on the Sunday after Halloween 2's Friday opening. The box office results had been so spectacular that producer Dino De Laurentiis said to co-producer Deborah Hill, "Let's do another one. Let's do 3. And so they did. But Hill and her partner in the first 2 films, John Carpenter, did not merely want to rehash the same story. Nor did they want to use the same cast, a risky move in that too many moviegoers the first 2 films were distinguished by the terrorized presence of Jamie Lee Curtis. However, the duo felt that not only had they milked the format of a lunatic on the loose versus a panic female, but other movie makers had done so well in such efforts as Terror Train starring Miss Curtis, He Knows You're Alone, Deadly Blessing, and many, many more. They had to try something new and different. Screenwriter Nigel Neal happened to be in Los Angeles at this time, holding script conferences at Universal Pictures for their planned remake of The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is presently on hold but will one day be directed by Joe Dante, former FM contributor and the man who made us howl with The Howling. Since Universal was the studio backing the new Halloween film, it's no surprise that Neal's name came up as a potential scripter. Nor was the British writer exactly a novice in this field. He has written the screenplays for such classics as The Creeping Unknown, Enemy from Space, and 5 Million Years to Earth, the legendary science fiction films featuring the headstrong Professor Quatermass. Ray Harryhausen's underrated film version of H.G. Wells' classic novel First Men in the Moon, the teleplay for the abominable snowman of the Himalayas, a BBC cast which was made into the best of the Yeti films and starred fantasy film veteran Peter Cushing. Neal delved into the origins of Halloween itself and the ancient and mystical powers of Stonehenge in England, throwing in a modernistic slant of computer technology to complete his wicked brew. The results are fresh, fascinating, and frightening. The article continues with a synopsis of the film and then concludes with this. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, began its principal photography on April 19th of this year, shooting on a 6-week schedule and finishing on time on May 28th. The $2.5 million spent on the film is the lowest possible, still using a union crew, which has minimum wage requirements. The talent of the filmmakers ensured that the movie looked much more expensive than that. One of the assets in achieving this goal was the selection of the town used to represent the fictitious Santa Mira. The site was Loleta in Northern California, a city selected after some 1,500 miles of California country was scoured by the producers. Hill states that for the week the crew spent shooting there, it was not at all difficult to imagine that the events described in the screenplay were real. There was something mysterious about Loleta, she says with a shudder. The performers in Halloween 3 are from varied backgrounds, two of them being no strangers to the fantasy film genre. Tom Atkins, the film's Dr. Chalice, first worked with both Deborah Hill and John Carpenter on The Fog, in which Jamie Lee Curtis also starred. His other roles include a featured part in Carpenter's Escape from New York and in George Romero's horror omnibus film, Creepshow. Diane O'Harely, who plays Cochrane, starred in the doomsday thriller Failsafe and co-starred with Orson Welles as Banquo's ghost and the Three Witches in the film version of Macbeth. Stacey Nelkin, as Ellie, is the only newcomer to the horror fantasy scene. Her previous films include Mad Magazine's Up the Academy and the real-life horror film The Triangle Factory Fire Scandal. John Carpenter was busy with The Thing and, unable to direct this picture, handed the task to his lifelong friend Tommy Lee Wallace. They grew up together in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and attended school together at USC. Wallace was the production designer on Carpenter's first film, Dark Star, and worked as the editor on both Halloween and The Fog. He worked the screenplay for Dino De Laurentiis's horror film Amityville: The Possession, a sequel to the successful Amityville Horror. Apart from being that rarity, a good sequel, Halloween 3 is historic in another way. It has what must be the weightiest, most complicated above-the-title credit line of all time. Here it is, for your amusement and enlightenment. Universal Pictures presents a Mustafa Akkad presentation, a Dino De Laurentiis Corporation film, a John Carpenter Deborah Hill production, a film by Tommy Lee Wallace. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. That is all for this week's spooky look at Famous Monsters of Filmland. We will have more next week. For MKR, this is Kenny saying adios.
Sometime in the near future, when we least expect it, they will come. 5 million years to Earth. Cities will burn. Mankind will panic. Our world will tremble. When it occurs, you will see men turned killers by mysterious power.
I wanted to kill you.
Why?
Because you are different.
Women will be defiled by the invaders from outer space.
It's Barbara. She's the one.
It could happen in your lifetime. See 5 million years to Earth before it's too late.
100,000 years ago, it came to our galaxy. Trapped in the wasteland of Antarctica, it could not escape. Now, it is free to become one of us. John Carpenter's The Thing, rated R.
This is Count Vlad, but you may recognize me by my more familiar name, Count Dracula, and I'm here to offer you a friendly warning. Derek and his guests often get excited, and occasionally this results in revealing key plot points of the movies they're discussing. In your parlance, you might call these revelations spoilers. You know how the children of the night, monster kids can get sometimes. So consider yourself warned. And don't come begging to me to kill them for their transgressions afterward. I have more pressing issues to take care of, like that pesky Van Helsing.
So in just over a year and a handful of days since the release of House of Frankenstein, Universal released what many consider the last of the Monster Rally films or the Universal cycle, and we'll talk about whether or not that's true. And that movie was House of Dracula, which is the movie that we're going to be talking about today. Now, we did talk briefly about it on the show many, many moons ago when I had Frank Dietz on the show to talk about House of Frankenstein and kind of dovetailed into House of Dracula a little bit. But I want to give some shine to House of Dracula directly, and I want to do it with Stephen D. Sullivan, the man who is joining me this week on the show. Welcome back to Monster Kid Radio. It's not been a year and a handful of days since I've had you on.
It just feels like it, because every week without being on Monster Kid Radio is like a month. So, is that MKR years then? Hey, it's great
podcasting
to be back.
years.
That's what I'm saying. In pod years.
So House of Dracula, man, this is one that I want to talk about, and I want to talk about your connection to it, because you brought up both of the House movies when we were talking recently, and that's what kind of prompted me to want to do House of Dracula. But I want to give you a few minutes. The floor is yours. What's going on with Stephen D. Sullivan, man?
What's going on right now is I am finishing what I hope will be the final draft of my upcoming werewolf book, before sending that to the licensor to make sure that they approve it, which would lead to releasing it early next year, I hope. Or certainly before. It would be a great Halloween release, but I would hate to hold it for 6 months to do that. So cross your fingers, and hopefully by summer the werewolf book will be out. So there's that. Monster Shark on a Nude Beach continues to run on Amazon's Kindle Vella program. New episodes of that every 2 weeks. You've been playing some of the commercials that I did for it on Monster Kid Radio and on your stream. So there's that. And it's Halloween season, so soon there will be a new Frost Arrow story, a new original Frost Arrow story up on my site that I haven't written yet. So that's on the that's on the near horizon. And of course, Atomic Tales continues coming out every month from me and from St. Euphoria Productions and Christopher R. Mim. And I continue to have a blast with that.
All right.
And that's plenty,
time, right? Record time for Steve's moment of pitching. SDSullivan.com, StephenDSullivan.com, PaySteve.com. Of course, links in the show notes. Every time we have somebody on the show and they've got a website or something to promote, and in Steve's case, there's a lot to promote.
Always.
Make sure there's a chunk there, so please go support Steve when you're done listening to this episode of MKR, especially if you happen to like what he says about House of Dracula. So Steve told me about how he first came across or a connection that he has to House of Dracula via Famous Monsters of Filmland. And I sent that information off to Kenny.
Did someone mention Famous Monsters of Filmland? So let's take a look at what young Steve Sullivan saw in early 1967 when he came upon the House of Dracula feature in Famous Monsters 43. It was a whopping 18 pages long with 35, count them, 35 pictures. Was Steve inspired by the writing? I am reminded of his adaptations of White Zombie and Mano's Hands of Fate. The article is a detailed film book, the plot of the film in the form of an illustrated short story. Let's hear how our favorite monsters were introduced to get an idea what young Sullivan read. First up, Dracula. He whirled then, and the knowledge was ice in his breast, even before he met the mocking, luminous eyes of the strange figure, and saw the identical Dracula crest on the ring of the one who had called himself Baron Latos. Yes, Doctor, doubt if you will, but you see before you a man who has lived through the centuries on the blood of helpless, innocent victims. That is why I have come here, knowing of your studies, to plead with you for some release from the dread curse that enslaves me. Edelman swayed dazedly. Legend says a vampire must return to the soil of his grave before sunrise. In that coffin, Dracula snarled, is the soil of my birthplace. I need only return here before the rays of the sun can touch me, and I am safe. A pleading note came into his voice. But you must save me. You have done so much for others. Next, the Wolfman. Inside, Edelman stared sadly at the young, handsome figure behind the bars. Only horror in the man's face marred the pleasant lines of his youthful face. At the sight of Edelman, he cried, "It's too late. I went to plead for your help, but it's too late now. The moon is rising, and when it rises full, I'll turn into a beast, a werewolf, whose one desire is to kill. Kill!" Now, Edelman soothed. "You're imagining." Before he could say more, a ray of the full moon crept into the cell, and in its weird blue light he saw the horror. For the moonlight fell on Larry Talbot. A terrible shriek was torn from his throat. Then he fell to the floor, writhing, and before their horrified gaze the change took place. In cold horror, Edelman saw the young face turn bestial, saw the long fangs jut from slavering jaws, saw the coarse hair spring from the smooth young hands whose nails were suddenly terrible talons flexed with the lust to rend a human flesh. Last but not least, Frankenstein's monster. Suddenly, a low, moaning cry escaped Talbot's lips. Following his pointing finger, Dr. Edelman felt his hackles rising. There, in the soft ooze of the cavern's floor, lay a hideous monstrosity, a grotesque mockery of tortured humanity. Glenn Strange. "The monster!" Edelman gasped. "The Frankenstein monster! I knew that many years ago Dr. Neiman revitalized it, but then they both disappeared near this castle. That skeleton nearby must be Neiman, destroyed by his rash recreation." A surge of flaming excitement swept him up. Where he failed, I can succeed. I shall bring the monster to life and learn from him the eternal secrets of life and death. Young Steve must have especially been thrilled by the fantastic photos, a combination of behind-the-scenes pictures, publicity shots, and scenes from the movie. All the monsters are featured on the first page with a reprint of a classic poster. We then find 4 pictures of John Carradine's Dracula, 5 pictures of Lon Chaney's Wolfman, and 16 photos of Glenn Strange's Frankenstein. Jane Addams' Hunchback and Onslow Stevens' Mad Scientist are also featured prominently. My favorites are the candid behind-the-scenes shots. One has Glenn Strange's Frankie with Andy Devine's young sons, and another with a smiling Jane Addams hugging Frankenstein. We also have a shot of Lon Chaney helping Glenn with his outfit, a shot of Onslow Stevens making up his identical twin stunt double, and Lon Chaney's stand-in offering water via straw to the Wolfman. With all that, it's no wonder Steve became a fan of the movie before even seeing it. Let's hear what else he has to say about that.
Yeah, I first encountered House of Draculas were in the first issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland that I ever bought, which I think was issue 43. It's got a painting of Christopher Lee's Dracula. I now realize didn't at the time, climbing out of a coffin. And I thought, boy, didn't I read about it first in Famous Monsters? And when I looked it up online, I was like, holy cow, it was in the first Famous Monsters that I ever saw, the first one I ever read. And it has a long, I guess it's a film book. It's like a breakdown of the entire movie done in chapters, like a mini novel. He used to have a word for that, I think, and I can't remember what it was.
Something that Famous Monsters used to do. Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah, I think he called them film books or something. Forrest Ackerman had a title for that, and maybe Kenny could tell us if we don't, or if it doesn't pop into our heads. But anyway, I looked at it last night and I was like, wow, this is really cool. And boy, the wave of nostalgia that watched over me at that point was just almost overwhelming. Yeah,
very cool.
It's a strange connection, and when I used the internet to look up what issue of Famous Monsters the House of Dracula was in, I had no idea it was the first one that I'd ever seen. I just remembered it, and maybe the memory is really so vivid because it was that first exposure, as opposed to the years that follow where I had a subscription to Famous Monsters and that kind of stuff.
Right on, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, Famous Monsters memories are almost always super cool.
Which is not something that I have any Because by the time I started embracing all of this,
I know, you youngsters.
Famous Monsters was run by Ray Ferry, and, you know, yeah, there's a whole bunch of drama there. So, although interesting news regarding Famous Monsters, have you seen that somebody picked up the brand?
No.
That it's going to be making a comeback, hopefully.
Cool.
Which would be kind of cool. Who was it? I'm going to double check. They just announced it, too, which I thought was kind of cool. Corey Taylor, who is the frontman of the band Slipknot, now owns Famous Monsters. I'm assuming he's going to do magazines and everything else with it, but he's a monster kid, so I'm glad somebody who is invested in this kind of stuff owns the brand now, and I hope we continue to see some classic stuff.
Magazines are a cool way to learn about monster movies in the days before we had streaming or even DVDs or even videotapes. It was about the only way you could learn about these things. And then if you were lucky, you could find them at a revival theater or some Halloween night. I remember the first time I saw The Wolfman was I think I was in junior high, but it was at the high school in town. They had a Halloween movie night one year. They had, I think, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which we'll probably mention later. And they had The Wolfman, and they had a bunch of those. I don't remember if it was the Castle Company. There's some company that put out condensed versions of monster movies.
Yeah.
And one of the ones they did was Revenge of the Creature. And I remember, I think there were maybe a couple of others, but I remember seeing the 10-minute version of Revenge of the Creature that night. And it was pretty cool.
Castle Films, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think it was, and no relation to William Castle. But Castle were they were the ones that would sell them to you. And I assume that may have been the same people that provided them to schools and libraries and stuff, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. But again, another cool experience that I never got.
Oh, I'm so sad.
It is what it is, man.
But on the other hand, you grew up with videotapes.
You know, it's not the same, dude.
No, I know it's not the same.
And for where I was when I was growing up, it's not like this stuff was on the shelf. You know, we've talked a lot. Beth and I have talked a lot about the differences between my upbringing and her upbringing, and I think you and I have even talked a little bit too in regards to the Satanic Panic and where I lived at the time and what I was surrounding myself with at the time. I didn't have access to a lot of this monster stuff. I had the Crestwood House books.
Right.
That was pretty much it.
Which I didn't even hear of until you started talking about them.
Right. And now you've got a complete set, and I still only have like...
I think I do, because right at the beginning of the pandemic, before they got really expensive, that was like my way of not going insane during the start of the pandemic, was trying to find the ones I didn't have and pick them up for less than an arm and a leg.
You know, it all goes back to Famous Monsters, because so many of the photos provided to the publishers for those books came from Ackerman, the man behind Famous Monsters. So, you know, it all kind of comes together and goes back to FM. I mean, even the myth that there were two different versions of King Kong versus Godzilla get reprinted in Crestwood House, which was, again, a myth that was popularized by FM.
Right,
so,
yep. Fari put that out there, even though it's completely not true.
Not true one bit.
So, but you know, those are the kind of things that happen when you're putting out a monthly magazine or, you know, an old newspaper or whatever. There was always column inches to fill, and so speculation would suddenly become fact because you put them down in print, and people are like, hey, I can't print it if it's not true. Well, that's never been true.
Right.
All you need to print something is a printing press. Truth is not a requirement.
You know, it's kind of sort of related. How many people still believe that the War of the Worlds radio broadcast caused mass hysteria, when really that was the newspapers really kind of exaggerating all that? And if it was in print, well, obviously it was true, but was it really?
Right.
Not to that extent.
Yeah, it was small.
But the newspaper said it was.
You know, there were definitely people that were upset about that.
But the newspapers had a vested interest in, you know, don't trust the radio, trust the newspaper. See, radio can cause panic. We didn't do that. So
not us. Yeah. Not me.
So anyway, I find it fascinating.
Are there any myths about the House of Dracula?
I don't know. Nothing that on that scale. I mean, there are people that have certain beliefs and such regarding the film, which is something I want to talk about. and I mentioned this earlier, there are some folks who consider this the last of the big Universal stuff and don't consider Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein part of the canon or the cycle.
The continuity.
But I disagree.
I know you do.
And you do too, I believe, right?
Oh, I actually, in Steve's personal timeline of the Universal films, how the Abbott and Costello film is somewhere before the Wolfman is cured in the spoilers,
which is a popular take
in the end of House of Dracula.
Yeah,
because there is a discontinuity between House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula that I'm sure we'll talk about a little later. So
sure, it's because he's got a mustache. That's the biggest thing, right?
Well, yeah, that's the problem. It's the Chaney mustache.
It's the Chaney mustache. So Chaney, okay, I want to address that real quick. There is a mustache here. This is the only time Talbot has a mustache, and it's basically because Lon Chaney Jr. had been spending the past 8 movies doing Inner Sanctum films where he wore the mustache.
I was going to guess that was the reason. I was like, could it have anything to do with the Inner Sanctum films?
Yeah, all these Inner Sanctum films, which are amazing, especially A Weird Woman. I really like Calling Dr. Death, though, too. That one's really good, too.
Yeah, I like the whole series. They're really, really amusing. Weird Woman is the one that's kind of above all the others because it's based on a great novel. But
yeah. And we have talked about Inner Sanctum movies as a whole here on the podcast in the past, but I wouldn't mind revisiting them at some point because they are that good. But Lon Chaney Jr. finally got to play this tragic romantic lead in a lot of those movies, which is something that he wanted to do.
Yes.
Universal still painted it with kind of a suspense thriller horror brush, but he still got a chance to do some of that. And part of that involved having that mustache.
Right, and he got to stretch a little bit, although,
Sure.
The Wolfman is such a great acting job, and it's his iconic role. I could see wanting to expand beyond that, but it's not like that's a bad role to have. It's not. The Wolfman has a lot more breadth than Christopher Lee's portrayal of Dracula, who spends a lot of time kind of frowning and growling and, doesn't even speak in one of my favorite films. And so I can understand Christopher Lee getting tired of kind of parading around in the cape and going, you shall do this. And then people do that. But the Wolfman actually has some depths, especially coming from the first 2 films, where he's got a range of emotions and he really gets a good part to chew on, as it were. So I'm a little less sympathetic that the Wolfman's not a great part, because I think the Wolfman is a great part. And it's probably the greatest part in the Universal canon. I think it's the one that really stands out as a rounded character, as a human being among the monsters. And that's nothing against Karloff's portrayal of the Frankenstein monster, which is amazing, or Lugosi's portrayal of Igor, which is also amazing.
Yeah, no, and he really does bring so much emotional depth and weight to the character. There's a moment in House of Dracula where a nurse is talking Dr. Neyman, or Edelman, excuse me. First time I made that mistake, I'll probably make it 3 or 4 more times. There's a nurse telling Dr. Edelman that there was a man here, and he seemed so tragic and so lost, and just he really needed help. It was so obvious. Well, that nurse was speaking redundantly, because Lon Chaney did that. I mean, it was nice that she said it, sure, but we already got that, and yeah.
Right. Although there is, it is some kind of foreshadowing what's otherwise a fairly brief experience in the film. And there's a lot of the film, I noticed when I rewatched it last night, there's a lot of the film where they're kind of telling you stuff that maybe you could figure out on your own from what else was going around in the story, but they want to make sure you get the point. So Lon comes in, he plays the tragic character, and he leaves. And then the nurse says, he seems so haunted. He seems so sad. And, and Edelman's like, maybe he'll come back. Busy doctor. We get that. That's some things never change, right? The doctors are always busy. So, but you're right. In some ways, that little speech is unnecessary because we've already gotten that from how Cheney's portrayed it.
Well,
Because
I mean, he really
at
did
this
make
point
that
he's so
character his
good
own.
at
I mean, and I
portraying
think he's
Talbot.
gone on record as saying that that's his guy. That's, you know, he can't imagine anybody else playing him either, and I can't. I wouldn't want to see anybody else try to take on that character. It's just so much what he brings to the table. The visual, the design, the Jack Pierce makeup looks cool. But if you don't have Cheney grounding it, it's not nearly as good.
Which is why the Wolfman and the Wolfman series stands out among all other werewolf pictures, with the possible exception of Paul Naschy's Valdemar Daninsky stories. And he was reproducing what he saw in Cheney when he was a kid, meaning Naschy was. That part of the Wolfman touched him, and when he created the Daninsky character, he was recreating, in a sense, the tragedy of the Wolfman and Larry Talbot. I don't think there's any question of that. And that's why, for me, the Daninsky series is my other favorite werewolf series. Easily above all. You know, I like The Howling and all the, you know, a lot of the modern werewolf kind of stuff. But it's Talbot and Daninsky for me, because those are the ones that had the werewolves that,
you've got to have that human
and make you
anchor,
feel for them.
I feel like. You really do. Yeah, so this is the third time the monsters start to meet up. We first saw Frankenstein meet the Wolfman, then all three of them, you know, Dracula gets thrown into the mix with House of Frankenstein in a weird kind of way. I enjoy House of Frankenstein quite a bit, mostly because I think Karloff is just amazing in that.
Right, I was going to say the same thing. I like House of Frankenstein, but it is almost 2 or 3 little movies linked together by a traveling sideshow.
Which would make a great anthology series. Somebody, you know, and I even know that Universal, I think in the 90s, was it the 90s? They did a TV miniseries, House of Frankenstein, set in modern day or whatever, and they did a bunch of stuff. But no, man, bring this back as an anthology series. Forget the Dark Universe stuff. Keep Tom Cruise away from it. Give me a House of anthology series. That would be amazing. I'd love to see that.
Well, you know, and it could play really well on TV. I mean, we've just seen Werewolf by Night on TV for Marvel, and it's clear that if you do this well, that it can work on television.
Mm-hmm.
Even today with jaded audiences, blah 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 blah.
Which
but Werewolf by Night rocks. It's a very, very cool revival of the idea, and obviously Jack Russell, the Werewolf by Night, is yet another Lon Chaney, Larry Talbot iteration.
Mm-hmm.
Just through a comics medium, and we love that too.
So I want to dovetail real quick, because I'm going to be talking about this here in a future episode of Monster Kid Radio. But the folks over at Giant Freaking Robot at giantfreakingrobot.com 5 days ago, as of this recording, posted an article called "Are the Universal Monsters Dead Forever?" And they go through.
No.
Okay, so first,
no.
Okay, they aren't kind. The author of the article is not kind to our favorite Universal monsters, and
well, you know,
I would have words.
It's one of those things. Well, you know, I mean, you can always leave comments in the comments, but comments are for cranks a lot of the time. So you could leave words there, but they won't do any good.
I'm just going to dedicate a whole episode to it. What are you talking about?
Better to write your own article, to get a bunch of us on, you know, me and a bunch of other people that vehemently disagree with that idea, and have us on and prove just how totally wrong they are.
Yeah. So,
and I wasn't going to blow my own horn, but you know, I just fairly recently did do Dr. Cushing, Chamber of Horrors, which is clearly a tribute to the Universal horror films as well as Hammer horror films. And the sequel, if and when I get around to it, is going to be, you're going to get some of that traveling sideshow stuff going on from House of Frankenstein, even though I prefer House of Dracula as a movie to House of Frankenstein.
So how much time passes between House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, you think, in terms of the story?
They say in the story, they say that Karloff's character, the Frankenstein monster, disappeared into the swamp years ago, right? So we know it's at least a couple of years, but it's unclear. They may have even said 5 or 6 years ago. I don't remember. Universal liked to do time lapses in between their monster movies sometimes.
I was about to say we're about to have a Mummy situation.
Right.
Where...
in which 25 years passes between every Mummy movie. So the last of the Mummy movies is like in 2050 or something like that. Right.
And geographically it changes too.
Right. Yeah. And they've done that again here too.
They did. I thought it would be interesting at one point to go through and create a massive timeline of the big three monster project franchises, right? Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, and just kind of line things up. Now, it got pretty crazy making, and if I didn't already shave my head, I'd be pulling my hair out trying to figure it out because of things like this. Plus, there aren't enough real touchstones to tell us, okay, this is when this movie took place.
Right.
When did Dracula happen? Well,
right.
Maybe we could look at a journal entry from the novel, and maybe, I don't know, but so...
Yeah, and I faced a similar kind of task
with what you did.
Trying to put all the Valdemar Janicki films into a timeline so that there was some kind of continuity for the book that I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
And it was torturous because, like Paul Naschy doing those films, the Universal people didn't care about that. They wanted enough of a touchstone so that you'd get the same audience back, but they didn't really care about continuity, as it were. And
well, this is different back then too, because it's not like you said earlier. I had VHS. You had Famous Monsters magazine, but back then, you saw the movie a year ago. Remember what happened in it? Maybe
it was one and done. And exactly. Which is why all people complain about how terrible trailers are right now. And trailers have always been terrible because they were always counting on you forgetting what you'd seen in the trailer, trying to give you the most exciting stuff. So you'd have the house falling down, burning on the Frankenstein monster in the trailer, and then you'd forget that by the time you saw the film and wouldn't realize that that's actually the end of the film. It's like, oh, that was the last shot in the film we just saw.
Right.
But back then, the way things were, people were even less likely to remember the trailers than they are now, where obviously you can just watch them incessantly and say, hey, wasn't Jern Erso supposed to be chased by a TIE fighter during, or whatever?
Yeah. Well, and even now, we do that with trailers now, too.
Yes.
Nobody was watching the trailers were more disposable than the movies, and the movies were disposable back then. So
right. Because and you were going to see them once and possibly never again. Though Universal, God rest their soul, or God bless their souls rather, did have a concept that they could resell these movies again, which they got from reselling Frankenstein and Dracula earlier. And I think that's one of the reasons when I fired up my Blu-ray of House of Dracula last night. I watched House of Frankenstein too. But when I fired up the Blu-ray, I turned to my wife Kiff and I said, look at this, it's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's gorgeous as opposed to a lot of other films you see, because whatever you may think of the monster version, how that's turned out, Universal has been a very good caretaker of their monster properties from the time they were created up to today.
Once they realized they could still be marketed and exploited and still make money, heck yeah.
Right. And as a result, they've taken really good care of them.
Yep.
So we get these pristine, beautiful Blu-ray copies of
Took them a while to do all the Blu-rays, but when they finally did,
it took them a while. But I mean, the same thing was true when they put them on DVD. It was like you roll them out slowly and make sure that people are going to buy them and support them before you get them on.
When I got the VHSs, it was during that Universal Monster Collection. I can still hear the voiceover. I'll even play the ad. Just why not? What the heck?
I bid you welcome.
MCA Universal Home Video announces the Universal Studios Monsters Classic Collection. These are the titles monster fans have been waiting to sink their teeth into. Now, at the spectacular price of $14.98 each, suggested retail. Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Phantom of the Opera, The Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Dracula, Son of Frankenstein, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, The Black Cat, The Raven. Plus these new releases, the Spanish version of Dracula, a collector's treasure. House of Frankenstein. The Invisible Man returns. Murders in the Rue Morgue. Werewolf of London. Tower of London. Dracula's Daughter. And The Mummy's Hand. Visit your local video retailer and ask for the Universal Studios Monsters Classic Collection. Classic monster titles.
I can still, I watched that and I was working at a Blockbuster Video, which meant what? Employee discount, and I was ordering every single one of them when they came out. So I had that wall
right
of all the Mummy films and the Frankenstein, all that stuff too.
We're working part-time at Best Buy. It was,
yeah,
you know, it's like, oh, employee discount on all this stuff.
Yep. I actually got in trouble because I would order a bunch of stuff in anticipation of payday coming, and new stuff, all the special order material that I had ordered was just stuck under a counter taking up space because, well, payday hadn't happened yet. It's like, no, just hold on till Friday. Derek, you can't keep, just give me till Friday.
I suppose since we've started talking about the film kind of a roundabout way, we ought to at least give a little synopsis of
that's
what's
kind of where I
going on.
wanted to go. I started rambling and I think we ended up going somewhere else. But yeah, so this movie takes place several years after House of Frankenstein. We have Dr. Edelman played by Onslow Stevens, who I think doesn't get talked about enough in the Universal monster. And I know he only did this one movie is what he's known for, I guess. But he's fantastic. He's great.
Yeah, no, he's great. He's really, really good. I thought earlier, you know, it's almost too bad they couldn't have had Lugosi playing Dracula and then Carradine playing the Edelman character. And then I thought, but Onslow Stevens is so good.
He really
is.
He's
not someone we see in a lot of other horror films. I didn't even realize until I looked it up that he's actually one of the generals in Them, which is, of course, a great film. And I think he's in The Monster and the Girl, that's one of the Monster Ape films. But I don't remember what character he's in. And certainly I never kind of noticed him and said, hey, that's Dr. Edelman in another film.
I noticed on his credits that he's in a movie called Life Returns from 1935, which I own, but I have never watched because I fear we're going to see footage of a dead dog in it, and I don't need to see that.
Oh, okay.
But it's a movie in which characters are trying to bring life to death, bring something back to life, and he plays one of the scientists in that. So it was kind of cool. I thought, okay, we got the scientist who's trying to bring life back to death, and then he eventually gets around to working on the Frankenstein monster. So I thought it was kind of neat. So
cool. I'll have to look that up and see if I can find it, because that would be
fun
domain.
to see.
But he's not in any of the other Universal classics that I know of, not even in a minor part, and he's terrific in this. He's playing a kindly doctor who has a seaside mansion or castle in Visaria, which is where a lot of the fake Universal country. It's the fake country that a lot of the Universal films take place. It's like Latveria from Marvel, right?
Right.
And this time it's on a seashore where before I think we've always assumed it was landlocked in Middle Europe somewhere, but it's a cliffside house, and he's running he's doing experiments to help mankind, and he's a doctor, and he's helping all the local people, so he's beloved. And suddenly one night Dracula shows up at his house and says, hey, I'm having some trouble, and I'd like to be cured of my lust for blood, please. And Edelman's such a nice guy. He's like, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I know you're a vampire, but we'll see what we can do. Come back tomorrow night.
First, he's not. He's like, I don't believe in vampires, but I believe that you believe you're a vampire. So.
Right. Yeah, because this is made right near the end of the war, where the shift was happening, even though we all didn't know it yet, from supernatural horror to scientific horrors. And this film kind of straddles that middle ground where the supernatural monsters show up at Dr. Edelman's looking to be scientifically cured. So we get first Dracula shows up, and there's a great scene where he takes the doctor into the basement of his own house, and there's Dracula's coffin. And and the doctor's like, well, how did this get here? And Dracula's like, well, since you don't believe this is supernatural, let's just say you left the door open.
I love that. I love that. See, when I first saw this film, when I first saw House of Frankenstein as well, I was disappointed because Carradine's no Lugosi, man.
He's not.
But that moment made me love Carradine as Dracula.
Yes.
You know, no, he's not Lugosi. Lugosi's tops. But that moment made me love Carradine as Dracula. It's like, let's just say you left the door unlocked.
And that's a great moment. There's a, you know, since we're talking Carradine, great moments. There's a great moment at the piano with Melissa, who's one of the heroines in the film, where she's playing, I think it's Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven or something like that. A romantic piece. And then suddenly she starts playing weird stuff because Dracula is standing next to her and is kind of focused on her as a victim. That's a great moment.
Oh,
to a
so
great
good.
Dracula moment within this film. Anyway, Dracula shows up to be cured, and no sooner is he left than who else shows up saying, "You have to help me." But Lawrence Talbot, the Wolfman, has also showed up to be cured.
Yep.
Which is, it's a pretty darn good setup, I have to say. For it doesn't hold well with the continuity from the end of the previous film, because apparently there was going to be another film in between that maybe had a little better continuity, but then, which was the Wolfman meets Dracula, or Wolfman versus Dracula. And I've read the script to that, and it starts off great and then completely falls apart.
Oh, it's too bad.
Which is a shame, but you can actually get a copy of it on Amazon. I think it's by Philip J. Riley.
Okay. Yeah.
Who used to be someone who was like a friend of mine on Facebook, and sadly passed away a number of years ago, not too long after I found these cool things that he was doing. Anyway, so the continuity's not really great, but it's the 1940s, and we're not going to say, hey, weren't they somewhere else the last time we saw them? Even though Universal had kind of been doing that previously, there's still that, people aren't going to remember that we killed the Wolfman and Dracula in the last picture, so let's start with that. Let's just start fresh with them.
Except when we find Frankenstein, it's totally wrapped up in the continuity. Kind of.
It is.
Or at least we reference it enough. So like, wait, what? But they just, what? Okay.
Why there should really be a bridge film in between. And I don't know that Wolfman versus Dracula was meant to be the bridge, because what I read over the last couple of days about this was that the Wolfman versus Dracula actually was the basis of this film. But I've read it, and it's like, if it was, it's it must have been a different version or something, because the two are nothing alike, except you do get an explanation for how at least the Wolfman is revived in the screenplay.
Right.
So, yeah, so it's like, forget about these two characters being dead, but here's a Frankenstein monster with Boris Karloff in its arms. Which happens because of a circumstance with the Wolfman. So the film is about the monsters coming to be cured or revived by Dr. Edelman. And he's got two beautiful nurses working for him, one of whom is a hunchback, played by Jane Addams' Nina, who is a character that I've always loved since the first time I saw it. It's like,
oh, she's fantastic, isn't she?
Yeah, she's really great.
Oh, man, she's so... And, I mean, she's Hippocratic Oath, altruistic. I mean, she's just a good person, you know? It's like, we only have enough mold, the special mold for one surgery. Well, don't waste it on me.
Don't waste it on me. We'll get me
guy.
later. Cure Mr. Talbot, because he's suffering the tortures of the damned. Yeah, she's a great character.
How fantastic is that?
And props to the screenwriters and the creators for deciding to make a really attractive woman a hunchback. You know, hey, we need a hunchback for this. Oh, why don't we make it the attractive assistant nurse? That is not where I don't know if I'd have thought of that.
Right.
And but Edward T. Lowe Jr., Dwight D. Babcock, and George Bricker, somewhere in that stew of people. And this was all written during the studio system. So there were potentially a lot of writers and a lot of drafts, a lot of revisions that went through this. But somehow they came up with that cool idea. And this great character who's if you have any empathy at all, you probably feel for her about as much as you do for the Wolfman.
Yeah.
So
it's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, so they're there trying to cure people, and of course it goes wrong.
Because of course it does. And in this particular case, the story does seem a little bit more connected. Whereas House of Frankenstein, like you said, it feels like it could have been 2 or 3 different little mini
It's kind of a little road
stories.
picture. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas this one, it's all connected for the most part. You probably didn't even need to have Frankenstein in here to make it a good movie.
Right.
Frankenstein's monster being thrown in there. I get why they did it. And I'm glad they gave, Glenn Strange some work. Cool.
Right.
Even if he spent a lot of it freezing to death and drunk out of his mind because Lon Chaney told him drinking would help keep him warm. Which, he's laying around in a bunch of cold mud. You got to do something. I'm not, whatever.
Right.
But yeah.
And, and that is a complaint that some people have had about this. And I could see that the Frankenstein monster doesn't really have a lot to do in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. He kind of shows up, gets in the final battle, and then the film ends. Because these films are super short.
They really
in
are.
terms of what we think of as full-length features. They're like, I think this one is 67 minutes.
Yep.
And I think House of Frankenstein is probably not much longer if it's longer. They're very short. They're under 70 minutes long, which is sad in a way because part of you is like, oh, I'd really like to see more of the Wolfman, more of the Frankenstein monster, more of the mad Dr. Edelman, because sadly, our hero has a problem during the film, thanks to Dracula. But on the other hand, it's like these films are bang, 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 bang. You get in, you get the characters in, you establish the problems, you move the plot forward, and then you're out. And there's very little wasted motion in them. Although I was sad that this one didn't even have Universal used to do a good cast is worth repeating and give you the title credits at the end.
Just the end.
This one, bang, the end, blackout, everybody leave the theater for the next show.
Yep.
So it's hard to argue with films that are this tight, though.
Now, the director, Erle C. Kenton, his directing career goes back to 1919. And most of his film work prior to 1925 were all shorts. So, yeah, super short, super tight, get in, get out, do your thing, and then move on to the next one or move on to the next setup or whatever. He had a heck of a career. There are so many movies and television series under his name.
Yeah.
This is, he also did House of Frankenstein and Ghost of Frankenstein and all these others. So
he went from the silence into the 1960s.
Yeah.
With television. And so he had a huge, broad career. Although when you look at IMDb, the things that he's known for are House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, Ghost of Frankenstein, and, and 1936, I think it's a Western. It's got to be. It's the same great picture. Yeah. So it's like he had a long career, but the things people remember are these cool Universal monster movies that he did.
Have you ever seen The Cat Creeps movie he did after this?
I'm not. I think so, but I wouldn't swear.
I haven't, but it looks like he's kind of got like a good haunted house vibe, which looks kind of cool. So.
Right. I think maybe I have, but those are kind of films that tend to blur together for me after a while, and I've seen an awful lot of them. So maybe not. There's one of those that's lost that I can never remember which one it is.
Right?
Yeah, I can never remember which one it is, but I know it's one of these old dark house cat creeps. The shadow in the basement kind of things. So maybe the answer is maybe.
Well, as you were saying, Dracula shows up and things kind of go awry. What's interesting to me is that Dracula, by Carradine, truly seems like he wants help.
Right.
He's done. He doesn't want to, and he's not going to introduce a new strain of bubonic plague to end the whole thing. He's
right.
He's just going to find a doctor to help him out.
Right, because it's the end of the war, and we're moving into the atomic age. We can solve anything.
Right. Unfortunately, things kind of shift a little bit, and I think it's when he realizes this other nurse that's there is somebody from his, for lack of a better phrase, his former life of being just a full-on bloodthirsty vampire dude.
Right.
And
Yeah.
those feelings start to come back, and he starts trying to seduce her and take her under his control.
Right.
And
I
now
want to be
he's the
cured as a
villain again.
vampire, but as long as I am, can't I just bite one of your nurses and take her away with
Right,
me?
right. Can't I just have the pretty blonde?
Right.
Really? You got another one, and you're going to fix her. Can I have this one?
Right.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
those moments,
exactly.
that piano sequence.
I don't know
that
if
you
we
mentioned
mentioned
earlier
that
is
Nina the Hunchback
amazing.
is also going to be cured by Dr.
Yeah.
Edelman.
I
He's,
think we kind of-
he's developed a miracle cure that allows him to reshape bone and all sorts of
Yeah.
things, and is going to fix the Wolfman through this surgeryless surgery, and he's also going
It
to
has
fix
to do with like
his hunchback.
mold that they're growing, and it's sciencey, but it's
Reverie
1940s
science, but it's
science.
still pretty cool.
Yeah.
I
But
bought
do
it as
love
a kid.
that.
I bought it.
I do love that piano moment, though. The Moonlight Sonata and the music she gets into playing, that just, oh, so good. And they even press in on the eyes of Carradine, trying to get the hypnotism angle going that they do with Lugosi and his eyes. Carradine's eyes aren't nearly as great, but they're still pretty good.
Right,
And
they're not as
it's
good
pretty
with
amazing.
they don't do the pinpoint spots, but there are a couple of more than one or two scenes where Carradine looks at the people and the Salter and Skinner hit their music cues, and you're like,
so
oh,
good.
he's completely hypnotizing these people.
So
And
good.
they're all screwed. They've put their they've let the fox into the hen house.
Yep.
And now he's still a fox. So
I
that's
love that-
wonderful.
I love that Edelman is, throughout all of this, up until when he finally accepts that Dracula is trying to take out one of his nurses, he's still, oh, that turning into a werewolf thing, that's just pressure on the brain where it makes his body do this. And he may as well have just said, it's just psychosomatic. I just,
right.
And I love
Well, he basically
that.
does say that.
Yeah. And when they find the Frankenstein monster's corpse, he's like, oh, well, that's interesting. What an interesting scientific discovery we just have underneath my castle,
I think
coincidentally.
I'll ramp him up a little bit.
Why not? Let's
bring
poke
him
around
back.
and see what happens.
At which point, Nina, the wonderful nurse, is like, talks him out of it. And it's like, oh, wait, that's never happens in these movies.
Right?
Someone
I
never
love
comes
that.
along
It's
and
such
says,
so
that's
good.
a bad idea.
So good.
And he listens. So,
No.
which is very cool. There's also a very cool scene where Edelman has been infected by Dracula, and there's kind of that universal swirl, and it's a combination of flashback and flash forward, where you see him, the kind of his dark side, thinking the things that he could do if he accepts the, falls under the Dracula power and stuff. And some of it is the Frankenstein monster running rampant in some clips from other films. But there's also a scene that in that little montage that I honestly did not remember, where he has actually cured Nina.
Yeah.
And she's no longer hunchbacked and is walking down the stairs as like a beautiful young debutante.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I did not remember that was part of his little Faustian dream and temptation here. And it's a very cool moment. And for all the fact that the people producing these films were churning them out fast, there's still little grace notes in them that are like that are the mark of really good movie making, even on a low budget, even on a tough time frame.
Here's what I love about that sequence. I love all the stuff that we see. I love that because of the sequence, the Frankenstein monster is played by 4 different people in this film. Because of all the stock footage. We see Karloff and Chaney and Eddie Parker, the stunt double, playing Frankenstein. Because we get shots from previous Frankenstein films. But what I really love about this sequence is that, we get that kind of supernatural, flashback stuff. But it started by symbols and symbology of science, electricity swirling around. It starts from a scientific point and then moves into that. And that to me just felt like a nice little touch for this doctor who is very, I don't believe it, but I believe that you believe it, supernatural kind of approach. So I like that through that we see the science kind of fade away as Dracula's presence and mind is taking over. And
Right.
I really loved that moment. I thought it was a really nice touch, probably completely accidental, but I love it, and that's my takeaway from it.
No, I agree
love all
that it's kind of mad science turns into the supernatural.
Right.
Science turns into mad science turns into the supernatural. It's
And I
very
love
cool.
that. It's so cool. And some of the supernatural stuff that we do see in here,
Yeah,
I think it's handled really, really well. The reflections of the mirrors. Everybody talks about how you see Bela Lugosi in the mirror in like Abbott and Costello or the original Dracula or whatever. There are some great mirror shots in here where you don't see Carradine in the reflection, or
even though you see this whole room around him and the
So
woman
great.
he's walking across the room, and I was watching that and I was going, did they? I don't see the split screen lines there. Did they?
It had to be.
Maybe they did a double set and had someone walking. It's just
something.
terrific.
It's amazing. And then Onslow Stevens fading away in his reflection when he's looking in the mirror. So
it's
good.
really good. And the Wolfman transformations aren't just still fades. The Wolfman's face kind of twitches and changes when they're doing the fades here, and it's really some of the most effective Wolfman transformations. It's really cool. And we know Jack Pierce was brilliant at this, and all his
This is
makeup
the last
work
thing
is
he
cool.
did for them, for these monsters. The last time he worked on them. So
which is, it's so sad in some ways, but that's the downside of the studio system. Is once you were, once they were onto something else, you were cut loose into space. And Pierce was off, like most of these people, off fending for himself when Universal moved on to other things. And since we're still talking about the supernatural stuff in the film, Dracula's vampire bat and his transformation to and from the bat have never looked better than they do in this film. They're just great work. Really great work.
I was paying attention to the bat in particular, and the wings are articulated, for crying out loud. It's not just, a 2-point kind of flappy. They're moving around. It's looking good.
It's the best rubber bat in an old horror movie by far. Even if this time, because of the Blu-ray, there was a scene where early on where it's like, oh look, they've got 4 or 5 wires on that bat, which is something you probably would not have seen in the movie theater, and you wouldn't have thought to look for it.
No,
there's a bat outside the window. You're not saying, oh look at the strings on the bat, but it's still it's a great prop, and the transition from prop into actual vampire is super impressive. And sometimes I know Abbott and Costello has a really good Walter Lantz animation transformation for Bela Lugosi too, but it's very similar to what's in this film, and this film is a number of years earlier, and they really went for it. And they also have some great moody shadow play things where sometimes the violence you're seeing is only seen in shadow and stuff, and it's
one
just
shot,
a really well made little picture.
It really is. When we said earlier about the eyes, they didn't put the little pin lights in the eyes of Carradine. It's like they didn't do a lot with extra light, but boy, they did a lot with shadow. And there's some really cool moments, especially towards the end when Onslow Stevens is kind of running around town, Dracula-ized, and he's running around, and there's a moment where he is running like away from the camera, but toward a light source or the other way around.
And his shadow is
just
getting larger
growing.
and larger.
It's looming over you as it's building and building and building, and it's so well done. There is some really good blocking and cinematography in here as well, with Lon Chaney, with Lawrence Talbot, as Lawrence Talbot, not as the Wolfman, which again I thought was super cool, facing off against Frankenstein's monster. These shots, they looked like things I could have seen in a comic book. They were so well done.
That's the beauty of, we've talked a little about the problems with the studio system, but the beauty of the studio system is that you can churn out, a film this good with this many great performances in it in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
It's really astonishing, and that's probably one of the reasons why the Universal films are so beloved by all of us, is because even though they were, and I've used this word a couple of times, and I don't want it to sound terrible, even though they were churning these out, the level of production on them is still far outstrips anything you saw in other horror movies before or until Hammer started doing their horror series, where, you know, they were dedicating the same kind of resources to doing one picture after another picture after another picture.
When it came to like the gothic horrors, I totally agree. I think once we start getting into like the sci-fi type horror stuff, you start seeing other studios make some really good attempts and efforts, like Them, for example.
Yes.
But when it comes to the gothic stuff, Universal was the king.
They were the king. I mean, we had, you know, we had the Return of the Vampire and you know, other things. There were individual films.
Sure.
That approached the Universal level of quality, and we could probably do a whole podcast about that. We should, like 3 that could have been Universal or something. But overall, the other films you saw from other studios, yeah, you know, maybe people might argue that MGM didn't care to do these. Yeah, probably, but they also couldn't. They weren't as good. You know, I like MGM's Spencer Tracy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Sure.
But it's not as good as, I don't like it nearly as much as any of the Universal horror films. Not a 1, I don't think. Except maybe She-Wolf of London.
Yeah, these are really, really solid films. They really knew what they were doing, knocking it out of the park every time.
And there's no wasted motion. It's just like,
yeah,
okay, we can get this done in 70 minutes. Bang, 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 and you're done. And one of the things I was sad I didn't have time to look up over the last day was figuring out how they played these in the theater, whether they were the A picture at the end, which I think they were, or if they were B picturing them with something else. But I don't think so. I don't know, and I didn't have time to look, and I wish I had.
Let's see. Previewed in November.
And it was released in December.
On a double bill with the Daltons Right Again.
Well, there you go. So they were doubling up, and I thought that's probably what they were doing.
It was a Lon Chaney double feature is what that was.
Well, exactly. And you got two different, you know, potentially two different crowds coming into the theater, because most or all of the theaters were owned by the studios back in the day. That was before they were forced to break up the studio distribution to their own theater thing. So there would be, you know, the Universal Theater here and the MGM Theater there, and they weren't necessarily called that, but that's the way it worked back at the time. Right. So yeah, no, it doesn't. And I'm sure that the Dalton probably played before this, though I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because they put some stars behind this. They had some, you know, it was the last hurrah almost of the Universal monsters.
It really was, and I want to talk about that because, again, I said at the beginning of this, there have been a lot of people that have kind of dismissed. I was actually surprised in the little research that I did that people are dismissing Abbott and Costello as not part of the cycle. I've always considered it part of the cycle. I don't understand why you wouldn't. It's got all the trappings. It's got all the characters. It's got everything going for it. I don't understand why you don't consider it part of the cycle other than it's a comedy and people don't want to laugh. I don't know.
Well, and it doesn't fit the continuity. And that's...
I mean...
You could say that same thing with this. It doesn't. You know, it's like, where does it fit in to the Universal cycle? I mean, I would tend to think that it would fit in between the two House movies. But then you have the question of, well, then how does the Frankenstein monster end up back in the pit? But that's the trouble with the end of the cycle here, is that they didn't care about the continuity. They kind of did. They only cared about the continuity when it was cool for the story. You know, so if we remind people of the Frankenstein monster being in the bog with Boris Karloff, it's cooler for the Frankenstein monster to be found with a skeleton of a mad scientist than it is for him to just walk in through the door and say, "Cure me," the way the other monsters are, right? So they cared, but they didn't care. And Abbott and Costello is kind of the prime example of, they just picked the characters up. They picked them up and said, okay, we've got this guy from Frankenstein. We've got Bela Lugosi. Why did we not use him again before this film? and we've got Lon Chaney as the Wolfman still. Let's just put them all together. We can do that, right? And I love that film. I love it dearly and
it's
deeply.
great. It's fantastic.
But where does it fit? And I know that you're one of those people that thinks, well, the Wolfman had a relapse and it fits in after. And there's
that's one of the arguments, sure.
And there's that great Return of the Wolfman book by you're going to have to remind me.
Jeff Roven.
Jeff Roven, right. And that's a great book that assumes that the Wolfman in that film it came after the House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. And he really makes it work. And that's a really superb version of the Universal monsters that he does in that book, which kind of caps off the series in a way. So I think the continuity bothers some people. I think that the comedy bothers some people, but there's always been at least a little comedy in the Universal Monster series. I mean, obviously things like The Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein.
All the James Whale stuff? Come on.
Right. And even in House of Dracula, there's that annoying villager whose name I don't remember, who's like the brother of the other guy that gets killed. And he's kind of creepy and weird, but also a little bit of that Universal comedy character.
Yep. Skelton Bean Nags is the actor, and he's a great character actor.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's a great look. But even if we go to, and I think this came up in a comment you made on somebody's Facebook post the other day about the Karl F. Lugosi Black Cat. Even in that, there are some side characters that have some comedy.
Yep.
And that movie is considered one of the scariest, most terrifying of the Universal cycle.
Well, and it's certainly one of the grimmest. I mean, it's,
So even in that, you've got the laughs, man.
Right. Yeah. Even in that, you got a little chuckles because that was part of how the horror films worked. And, and Shakespeare knew this too, not to completely compare the Universal monsters to Shakespeare, but why not? Because in all these serious Shakespeare tragedies, there's very often these they'd have the tragic act, and then there'd be, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I'm going to use them just as an example because that's all that pulls to mind. There would be like kind of a little comedy sketch in between with two of the other characters while Romeo and Juliet are considering killing themselves or whatever,
right.
And that's not, obviously, I'm not a Shakespeare historian, so I don't have the exact metaphors or the exact examples off the top of my head, but I think that you can get what I'm talking about, where comedy interspersed with tragedy or interspersed with horror has long been thought to make the horror potentially more horrible as well as more bearable for the audience. Because you don't want the audience you don't want the audience so terrified that they leave the theater, right?
Yeah. There's a sense of playfulness and fun to these movies that I think sometimes some of the other studios didn't have. Mark of the Vampire, for example, which, they tried, I'm sure, and, I know you've got other issues
right
regarding that movie, but, it doesn't have the sense of playfulness that these movies do. You don't have the song of the new wine in the middle of something. You don't have the two bickering, people, the couple that happen to be along for the ride. And
you don't have Una O'Connor screaming and running out of the room.
You don't have the James Whale touches. You don't have any of that stuff. And you don't have Abbott and Costello doing what they do best. Abbott and Costello, who are some of the only people that stayed on contract with Universal when they started cleaning house.
Right,
so,
Yeah, I noticed that too. It was like the people they kept on at house include Deanna Durbin, who is, if you've never seen Deanna Durbin, she's like a singer and actress kind of beyond the level of Judy Garland. She's like Judy, no offense, Judy. She's like Judy Garland without the drug problems.
Sure.
She's amazing. So I was like, yeah, I could see keeping her. And Abbott and Costello were, they kept like 5 people on contract as the studio changed hands right around now. And Abbott and Costello were 2 of them. You can see why. They were you got to go with your big breadwinners, especially
Yeah.
at the end of the war when people's tastes are changing. Maybe people are sick of grim horror stories after 4 or 5 years of people blowing each other up and shooting each other in Europe. So that makes sense, but it's hard life living in the studio system when that kind of stuff happens, or any corporation. So,
But on the other hand, that's how we end up with people like Onslow Stevens more than likely in a movie like this, when he has no business being in a movie like this. But, he's great.
Right, yeah, because he was a studio contract player, and they were like, who can we fill this with? And somehow somebody said, hey, he'd look really good in a beard and fright wig.
Right? Yeah, definitely. Let's put a little bit. I love that they put a little bit of old age makeup on him, and I'm sure it passed just fine back then. Now that we have it on Blu-ray and everything, it's like, oh yeah, we can see you're wearing makeup and powder in your hair. I get it, but I like that they did. It
still looks pretty good to me.
It still looks pretty good.
Bother me at all.
I'm glad they did it though, because then it allowed him to be able to do some of the more physically active stuff when he's being controlled by Dracula, and they didn't have to go to a stunt double for everything.
Right.
I'm not saying that he did all of his own stunts. I don't think that's true at all. But he was able to be a little bit more lithe and limber, and
it looked like he was crawling across the roof and stuff there, though. But,
yeah, and that was great.
Yep, great moments. Yeah, so Abbott and Costello, after this, where it fits in the continuity, in some sense, I don't think it really matters, because even though the comedy is there, and the comedy is the big thing in that film, as opposed to being a little break or a little sidelight in the other Universal films, the monster story in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is still a really good monster story.
Yep.
And the monsters are played straight. The monsters generate some laughs, but only because of the situations they're in, not because they're being absurd or ridiculous or, Herman Munster, for instance. And that's nothing against the Munsters, which is a show I really enjoy as a kid and still enjoy. So, yeah, it's hard to say. I think the continuity, for people that don't accept it, Derek, I think the continuity problem is the problem. But then House of Dracula has some pretty serious continuity problems.
Sure.
As
they
we
all
noted
do.
Earlier on.
They all do.
Yeah, most of them do. It's more obvious in this one because in the previous ones, they always explained to you why the people that looked like they were dead were not dead, really, or how they came back to life.
Right.
And here they're just like, oh, no one's going to remember we killed them. Just have them show up, because we got 70 minutes and we need to get this done. Just
right.
We can't give everyone's origin story all the time, guys.
Yeah.
And that's true. I'm sympathetic to that, especially since there are so many revivals or attempted revivals of old characters now that decide to start with the origin story, and all it does is slow the film down. So bravo, Universal. Sure, just drop the Wolfman and Dracula back into the continuity, and we'll assume they got out of the last fix they were in somehow.
I love these movies, man. I love these Universal movies so much. I feel like sometimes in my efforts to talk about all monster movies, I don't talk about the Universal stuff enough. And really, they're part of the building blocks, not just of horror cinema or cinema in general, but me as a monster kid, as a fan. These were the first round of movies that I saw. These were the thing. These were the ones that I collected and obsessed over and loved. And I don't talk about them enough. So to have an opportunity to revisit something that, and I said it already, I didn't like it the first time I saw it. I was disappointed. It's like, oh man, you did that to Dracula. Oh man, that's how it ended, But now that I watch it, you're like, dude, you were a dumb kid. And this is a really good flick, man.
I have my dumb kid movies too. Certainly some of them are probably somewhere in the Universal cycles. But I love these movies, and I never get tired of them, and I can watch them over and over again. And I've loved them since I was a little kid, since I first started seeing them on Boston's WCVB horror classics late at night, with introductions by Frank Avrush, who apparently never actually wore. We never saw him, but he did another show on Sunday where he wore a tuxedo, which was like classic films or something like that. I don't remember exactly what the title of it was. So I always pictured him being in a tuxedo as he introduced his voice introduced these horror classics late at night, and they used to play 2 of them every Saturday night. And my brother and I would sit around the tiny black and white set in our house and watch them.
Right on, dude. Just to kind of give people an idea in terms of what was happening with Universal when this movie came out, we had a few more horror movies starting to come out around this time. The next genre picture to be released by them was Pillow of Death, the final Inner Sanctum film. And then Steve's favorite, She-Wolf of London, came out at some point. We also had things like House of Horrors with Rondo Hatton, Spider-Woman Strikes Back, which I've never seen, but it keeps turning up on horror movie lists that I know I should probably watch. I think that's another Rondo Hatton film, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of like almost a sequel to Sherlock Holmes and Rondo Hatton film.
And Universal's starting to distribute some things too. Like they had the U.S. distribution of the anthology film Dead of Night, which is fantastic. So you've got some movies like that coming out as well. But this is definitely them getting away from the gothic horror stuff, and we're eventually going to start seeing the more science horror start to come in and creep in.
Right. Even the creeper stuff is not. It's quite
more
dark
dark mystery than anything else. There's no supernatural stuff going on. It's just a guy who doesn't look like us doing some things that we don't want to see him do. So,
right.
Yeah.
So there was this, and then it basically stopped, except for the Abbott and Costello monster series.
Yep. But it's a good film, and I recommend it. And if you haven't seen it, you need to, I feel like. You need to see this flick. It's great. I'm going to make sure there's a link in the show notes, of course, to where you can pick it up on DVD and Blu-ray and all that in the show notes.
Yeah,
please.
A lot of them are available streaming too now.
Yeah, but if you buy it physically through my link, I get like 5 cents or whatever. So
there is, and you definitely should do that.
Yeah.
And you'll always have them if you have the discs.
There you go. But it's good stuff.
Yeah, and if you like this, you'll probably like Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors that I've written.
Hey, I gave you your moment, man. It's
and a lot of my other stuff too. Yeah, but that was so long ago. They've even forgotten that it's sdsullivan.com, man.
Hey now. No, there will be a link in the show notes, of course, because you definitely want to keep up with what Steve's doing, because he's one of us, and we want to see us succeed with getting more Monster Kid stuff out in the world. So. Definitely support.
I love all you guys, gals, and everybody else out there.
Especially when you give them money.
Sometimes especially, but often
sometimes
just
especially.
As much either way. It's always nice meeting people that love the same stuff you do.
Yeah, no, and that's why I do what I do. It's just for the community, and I've talked a lot lately about changes coming to MKR and that sort of thing. And one of those things that's not going to change is the community aspect. So that's what I love about the show. I love talking with old friends and new, and I love talking with Steve. Now, we did talk at the beginning of this off mic about whether or not we're going to do the Classic 5, and I'm going to hold off. I'm going to hold off on the Classic 5 because there is a new deck coming, and I want when the new deck to come out, I want that to have some fanfare. So I'm like, oh, we missed it. So we're going to hold off on the Classic 5. But the Classic 5 will be coming back soon. Stay tuned for that.
Cool.
And of course, Steve will be on that on future episodes of the show, so you'll get to hear him play. So
yeah, we've got a rally. Half of a rally's coming up at some point.
Yeah, we still need to finish that up at some point this year.
That'd be good.
If I have my way and I can make everything work schedule-wise, maybe in December is when we're going to knock that out. But then we've also got episode 600 coming at some point, and I don't know what I'm doing for that either. So
maybe that should be it.
I've had some people want to see something like big, whatever. So we'll see.
Yeah, I hear that.
We'll see what happens.
Maybe we should do a big panel and have a bunch of us in, or like short clips on a bunch of us doing all the same movie, but in 20-minute segments or something.
Something. We'll figure it out.
It should be cool, whatever it is.
As long as just because there's so many changes happening for me, anything that takes less work to do, I'm all about.
Yeah, there is that.
Steve, thank you for doing this. Thank you for jumping in and doing this when I basically put you on the spot and said, let's do it. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm super happy to do it. I love this film. I love the series. Anything that includes the Wolfman in it, I'm in.
It's good stuff, man. It's hard to go wrong with Larry Talbot. It really is. The man, one of the greatest characters in all of horror.
Yep.
All right, Steve. Thank you for doing this. Again, stsullivan.com. Go check him out.
Very welcome.
Can't get enough.
Happy to be back anytime you want me. I love this place.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Monster Kid Radio. Thanks to Kenny. Thanks to Mark. Thanks to Steve. Thanks to you for being here and being part of what we do here on Monster Kid Radio. If you have any feedback for the show, again, you can email me at monsterkidradio@gmail.com, or you can call and leave me a voicemail at 360-524-2484. It has occurred to me that I do have a voicemail right now that I'm actually going to sit on until next week's episode. In fact, next week's episode might be a little light on content that I'm creating. So if you want to contribute to next week's show in any way, call in your favorite Halloween movies, Halloween traditions, thoughts on previous episodes of Monster Kid Radio, just in general Halloween stuff, whatever you want, within reason. I'd love to include you in the show. So please email me any audio content that you want to put together, or just call and leave me a voicemail. And don't worry, it is a 3-minute limit on the voicemail, but I can stitch voicemails together and make it smooth and sound like just one long voicemail. It's all good. I got you. But that's coming up next week. I can tell you right now, and I've not listened to it yet, but I've got like a 30-minute recording from Mark Matzke about Monster Bash. So we're going to be playing that next week at the very least. And yeah, I'd love to include anything that you've got as well. So call it in, send it in, and make sure you tune in. If you want to know anything about Monster Kid Radio, monsterkidradio.net is where you're going to want to go to follow up with everything that I've got going on, as well as everything going on with our various guests here on the show. There's, of course, links to Steve's book, Dr. Cushing's Chamber of Horrors. If you buy anything through any of the Amazon affiliate links, I get a little bit of scratch back on that, so please consider supporting the show that way as well. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Discord, Reddit, Patreon, and a whole bunch of other places. And, of course, on Twitch, where we're still showing stuff all the time now, basically. I tend to change out the programming once a week, at least. But, yeah, we're always showing stuff at twitch.tv/MonsterKidRadio. And with that, we're at the end of the show. So, Monster Kid Radio is a registered service mark of Monster Kid Radio, LLC. All original content of Monster Kid Radio by Monster Kid Radio, LLC is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 3.0 unported license. Of course, that doesn't apply to the song Out Cold. That belongs to Bloodshot Bill, copyright 2022. You can find it on their album, Songs from the Sludge. It just came out, as of this recording, as of today. So go check him out. Let him know that Monster Kid Radio sent you. My name's Derek M. Cook. I'll talk to everybody next week. Ciao.